All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here for today's webinar. I'm going to share my screen. Hi, Connie. Right, here we are. So thanks everyone for being here today and joining us for navigating Maine's policy making process. Appreciate you being here. Now is a good time to get familiar with all of your Zoom functions, knowing where your mic button is and your camera button. It's great to have cameras on, but certainly know that you can have them off at any time as well. And also get familiar with the chat box. And if you could introduce yourself in the chat box, that would be excellent. You can say what part of the state or country you're in and what organization you might work with. And at any time, you're welcome to enter any questions in the chat box as well. And Brooke can either answer them as we go. I wouldn't be surprised if that is your preference, Brooke, but we can also have time at the end for some questions and answers as well. So please take a moment to introduce yourself. My name is Kara Kaikini. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Maine State Breastfeeding Coalition. And before we officially get started, I wanted to make a couple of other announcements. First, to let you know that this is being recorded and is going to be available on our YouTube page. So know that you can find that, and links to that are on our website as well. And if you would like a certificate of attendance, we can send that to you once you fill out your evaluation. So you can get to that through this QR code here. I'll be sending a link to that evaluation at the end of the webinar as well. So please be sure to add your email to that evaluation if you would like the certificate sent to you. And just want to thank you for being here, and also thank you for donating with your registration. It does help us make these webinars possible. If you ever feel inspired to add more donations, we're happy to receive those. So thank you for your support. And our next webinar is coming up on December 5th, and the topic is going to be cannabis, pregnancy, and lactation. Brianna Bryant is going to be speaking and sharing the information that she has from her role in Bangor Public Health. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. We'll have that registration up soon. And for now, I want to introduce Brooke and welcome her. Brooke has devoted her career to public service with experience working for the Maine State Legislature, the United States Congress, the Biden-Harris transition team, and the Obama-Biden White House. She lives in Harpswell with her husband and 2 kids. And Brooke aims to help simplify the sometimes mystifying state policy-making process. I'm really looking forward to this. And Brooke is also a previous MSBC board member, so it's always good to see Brooke and really appreciate her being willing to share her expertise in this area. So give me a moment as I switch screens.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. Like Kara said, I'm a past board member, and I previously worked in the State House here in Maine, and then also in DC at different levels of federal policymaking. I am currently, once again, a federal employee, but I do want to emphasize I'm here in my personal capacity today. So I last gave a version of this presentation 3 years ago. It was October 2021,
Sorry.
and that's okay.
There.
Well, so while I was getting ready for today, I went back and watched the recording from my October 2021 presentation, and I was reminded that I was on maternity leave with my 11-week-old. I was even breastfeeding throughout the webinar. He's now a 3-year-old preschooler. And Kara, if you can go to the next slide. I got to celebrate with him last summer that paid family leave had become law. So there's just a screenshot from the Zoom, and it really helped me reflect on what else has happened since then. So we had a statewide election in 2022. That's when Governor Mills was reelected to her second term. and a new state legislature was elected. On the policy front, the donor breast milk bill was funded and signed into law by Governor Mills. Paid family leave passed and was signed into law by the governor after an incredible advocacy effort led by the Maine Women's Lobby, this coalition, and others. And thanks to that new law, Maine now has an office that's writing the rules to implement paid family leave over the coming years. Um, are there other updates or things that you want to celebrate that you've worked on over the past few years in the advocacy or policy realm?
So I can share that we helped get donor breast milk covered by Medicaid. We helped with that bill. And we're still continuing to be involved in that. It's not like, as you'll probably explain, Brooke, it's not like once a law is passed that the work is all done. There's definitely more steps to that. And so with the Medicaid coverage of donor breast milk, the process of getting that covered and providing the education around all of that, it continues to be needed. So that making sure that families know that it is something that is covered by Medicaid, and also making sure the providers know that it is covered by Medicaid and helping them get that process in place has been something we've been participating in as well, working very closely with the Mother's Milk Bank Northeast. And a year or two ago, there was also a law that passed that requires private insurance to cover donor breast milk in Maine as well. And that was essentially done without much of our help. So we're glad to see that the support was already there and we didn't really need to be as involved in that. And we're keeping our eyes open and our ears open to next possible steps in terms of legislation to support Medicaid reimbursement of doulas. So we are participating in the Maine Doula Coalition and keeping informed on that.
Amazing. Huge. Does anyone else have anything they want to pipe in with? Feel free to either in the chat. And as Kara said at the outset, we're a small group. Um, Feel free to put your hand up or just come off mute with questions or put them in the chat. I'm hoping that this can be a casual conversation. So if you think of anything, feel free to pipe in. But let's just pause for a moment to reflect. Wow, those are huge accomplishment over the last 3 years. Advocacy is a really powerful tool, and you don't have to be a professional lobbyist to be a successful advocate. In fact, in a state like Maine, citizens have really strong levels of access to policymaking officials, and really great levels of engagement. They're a crucial part of the policymaking process. And while today is going to focus on the how, the process, I don't want to lose sight of the why. The why is low-income families on Maine care with newborns with medical needs now have access to donor breast milk in the hospital. Um, New parents will soon have the opportunity to take the time they need to bond with their newborns without worrying about paying their bills or losing their jobs, no matter who their employer is. So those are really impactful changes in our state, and highlight what a powerful tool advocacy can be. Next slide, Kara. So I shared this slide last time as well, and I think for anyone who pays attention to the policymaking process, this comic might feel a little too real. The process for a bill to become a law can feel really mystifying. It's not what we learned on Schoolhouse Rock. It's long, it's complicated, there are a lot of steps, and it's different at the state level and the federal level. So if you feel confused or aren't sure where to begin, you are not alone in feeling that way. And I hope that this presentation can demystify it a little bit by just breaking it down into concrete steps. I also hope this webinar can help you think about ways that you can advocate for policies that you care about and feel more confident in your ability to tell your story and make change. Next slide, please. So this presentation today is going to focus on the state policy making. And so just to level set, as a Mainer, you have state representatives and state senators who are representing you and serving you at the State House in Augusta, and that's where state law comes from. They're also federal policymakers. So that's the congressmen, congresswomen, senators that represent and serve you in Washington, D.C. They're creating federal or nationwide laws. So depending on where you live in the state, that's either Congresswoman Shelley Pingree or Congressman Jared Golden. They're both also up for election next month. And you're also served by Senator Angus King and Senator Susan Collins. Those are your federal policymakers. Next slide, please. Today, we're focusing on state policymaking. So the state of Maine is represented by 35 state senators. They each represent around 37,000 people in Augusta, and also represented by 151 Maine state representatives. So those are the folks who are serving you. It's a part-time legislature. In the past, they've been paid about $12,000 a year. Um, Thankfully, I believe they've finally been able to increase their own pay. I think it's going to be more like $24,000, a little closer to a living wage, but still far below minimum wage for the hours they work.
Brooke, can I
So
ask a question there? Is that the
sure.
same for senators and representatives, or is
It's the
there?
same for senators and representatives, and different from Congress, where in Washington, D.C., the senators have 6-year terms and the House members have 2 years terms. In Maine and Augusta, they all have 2-year terms. So the senators are all up for election every 2 years, just like the representatives. Um, so the reason I point out their pay is it means they have other jobs, they have other things going on in their lives, or sometimes they're retired, but it's not a job where you can be a career politician. These are people who have, some of them are teachers, some of them are nurses, some of them work in nonprofits, some are realtors. It runs the gamut, lobstermen, because the amount of money they're making as a legislator is not enough to live. Um, on the House side, each representative represents around 9,000 people. That's based on geography. So, for example, I live in Harpswell. We only have about 5,000 people in the town of Harpswell. So we share our rep, Cheryl Golick, with part of Brunswick. But a place like Portland that has far more than 9,000 people, they have 7 reps that represent different neighborhoods or different geographies in Portland. I'm going to put in the chat this link where you can look up who your reps are. And I will note that they're all up for re-election in a month. So you might want to look up now and then look up again in a month because things change. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered who the different players are, let's talk a little bit about advocacy is, what lobbying is, and what's the difference. So a definition of advocacy is public support for a recommendation of a particular cause or policy. Advocacy is a crucial part of the democratic process that allows citizens to express their viewpoints and opinions to policymakers. And 501c3 nonprofits may engage in any type of advocacy, education, or lobbying that furthers their charitable purpose, but they may only engage in a small amount of legislative lobbying, and it must be reported to the IRS on a Form 990. I think these definitions are a little gray here. It's something that a lot of nonprofits have struggled to ensure that they're staying within the lines. And I know the Maine Association of Nonprofits has a lot of great resources. And I can put some of those in the chat at the end of the presentation too. Next slide, please. So all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And that's because in order to count as lobbying, it must meet 3 very specific criteria. So lobbying requires, number 1, communicating with policymakers. So that could be a legislator, it could be a legislative staff, it could be the governor or the governor's staff. Number 2, that communication has to be about specific legislation. And number 3, it has to be urging a vote for or against. So meeting with a state rep to talk about your organization's goals and educating her about why breast milk is important, that alone is not lobbying. It becomes lobbying when you're asking her to vote for or against a certain bill. Um, but having that conversation, that's advocacy, but probably not lobbying. And it is an important distinction because generally organizations like nonprofits cannot pay for lobbying with any government grants. And there might be other grant funding that limits lobbying using that specific funding. Next slide, please. So here, I wanted to brainstorm just a little bit about different ways that advocacy can take place in the legislative process. So I'm wondering if any of you have advocated for a policy proposal, um, and how you did that. And if not, if you have any ideas for what advocacy might look like. Kara, can I call on you?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's really great to explain. It's taking many years for me to fully understand the difference between lobbying and advocacy. And I think once I understood, well, like once it really clicked, it helped. Uh, and I think that we have done a lot of advocacy around paid leave, for instance, would and how I would explain how we've advocated is we've really provided education. We've done a lot of like sharing what the policy looks like and why this is important for people to consider, um, and shared ways that people could get involved. So through writing to their legislators or attending a public comment, submitting public comment, and writing letters to the editor. I mean, lots of different ways that people are able to get involved with that, with public policy.
Awesome. So, to, encouraging people to get involved, letters to the editor, testifying in support. Are there any others that anyone would like to jump in with? If not, Carrie, you can go to the next slide where I'd written down some of the ideas.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing to mention is this is focus on the state legislature, which I think is really important, but it's also great to know that this can, like policy proposals and advocacy around policy can also be done at your town level, it can be done at your school level, it can be done in your organization as well. So there are lots of ways that you can do this that it looks very similar, like the ways that I think you'll probably speak about. But it will look similar on a more local level as it does to the state level.
Absolutely. These tools can be used in all parts of your life. So, I think we talked about a few of these. There's also, Maine, distinct from some other states, and certainly distinct from U.S. Congress. Any citizen can sign up to testify before about a bill. That's a pretty big deal. That means that you get to go and speak on the record to a committee talking about them why this is a bill is a good idea or a bad idea. You can also organize a rally or a protest or a march. That's advocacy. Putting an opinion piece in the newspaper or a blog, talking to your legislator, maybe helping them write a speech in support of something that is important to you. Looking for funding, talking to the governor in any of these ways as well. So there's a lot of different ways to be an advocate. And you don't have to do all of them and you don't have to be good at all of them. You might see testify before a committee and think, that sounds like a nightmare, but you know what I'd be really good at? Writing letter to the editor. Or you might think, oh, I don't want to go and speak off the cuff to the committee, but I could submit written testimony that I prepare in advance. Or you might feel more comfortable organizing a protest or holding up signs. There's so many different ways to be involved, and they're all really important. So if one of these turns you off, don't think that that means that you can't be a successful advocate.
Yeah, another thing to add is even having conversations with your friends and family and neighbors, that can sometimes be more powerful than any of these others. if you can help them understand how they might be involved, because they might be people who would want to write a letter to the editor or testify, or they're always in contact with their legislators. And so having just being a contact point within your own friend and family community groups can be really powerful too.
I would take advantage of the fact that we're a small state, um, and we have a citizens legislature. These are not, career politicians who are inaccessible. These are folks that you can see at the farmer's market, at the library, at school. They're members of your community. If you don't know your member yet on, a conversational basis, I bet someone in your circle of friends does. And their job is to serve you. Their job is to find out what you care about and to represent you. Um, I recommend signing up for their newsletters, following them on Facebook or other social media. They'll often have, a town hall or come meet me at the brewery or come meet me at the farmer's market. I find that almost all of our legislators are really accessible, and they should be. That's what their job is. So find out that they're going to be, doing a community cleanup day and join and talk to them about what's on your mind. So, um, don't be intimidated. They're very much real people, especially with the election next month. There'll be a lot of freshman legislators, so first term legislators who are just getting their feet wet. And you may actually have more experience in advocacy and the process than they do. So you may become a resource to some of these newly elected members.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that they really need to hear from us in order to know what direction they might not have a strong opinion on something, or even if they do, they should really be representing their constituents. But they need to hear from you in order to know how you feel about things and how your groups of friends and family and communities and their districts feel about things. So there's a lot of power, I think, in writing to them and talking to them, even it may seem intimidating, but I really hope that this helps to make it feel less intimidating to talk to your local folks.
Yes. The Speaker of the House and where I worked and the President of the Senate, they have their own staff. Um, the rest of the legislators, they share staff among several members. So I think it's 10 state reps will share one staff. So they don't have personal assistants. They don't have someone else reading their email. They have a few hours of staff support a week, but they're doing their jobs themselves, and getting to hear from their community members is really meaningful part of their job.
Yeah, and I feel like I've heard feedback that they much prefer personalized emails too, not just the ones that are automatically sent if you click on a link. It's so easy to be able to do that if you're signed up on any listservs that say, tell your senators how you feel about this. Here's just like put your name on this letter that we've already created. I think there's something to that. If people get a lot of those, it can be powerful, I think. But I think they're more likely to read something that is is more personal.
And it doesn't have to be long, but adding a sentence up top to your email saying, "Hey, I live in this neighborhood of our town. My kid goes to this school. I work here," showing that you have a connection. They're trying to engage with you as a constituent and as a potential voter. So, um, all of those personal connections are really valuable. And there's a good chance they'll say, "Oh yeah, I know your neighbor so and so," or like, "I think I worked with your partner on whatever project."
Mm. Brooke, can you say more about the asking for a floor speech?
Sure. So when a bill hits the floor, so in the House and the Senate after they pass committee, um, it has receives a vote on the floor. And before the vote, any member is allowed to request time, just by raising their hand, and they get put in the queue, and they receive a few minutes to give a speech. And it can be um, off the cuff. They heard something in another speech they were passionate about, and they wanted to come give their stance, or it can be prepared. And with the prepared speeches, it might be something like, that the donor breast milk bill is coming for a vote. And that this person said they'd vote for it, but they don't actually know very much about it. You could say, hey, I would really love for you to tell the story of Susie in my community who was able to get donor breast milk for her child because of this bill. And here's a blurb about Susie's story, and would love for you to share it. You are helping them develop a speech. If they agree, then they can go in front of the whole House, or Senate, and present that information. It's a way to get a lot of visibility, and again, because the staff are stretched so thin and members aren't necessarily experts on every issue, they can't be. Having someone else, an advocate who knows what they're talking about, provide that information can really make the difference and make it possible for them to give a speech they wouldn't necessarily been able to do otherwise.
Okay. That's really interesting. So it's not that a constituent could go and give a speech on the floor. It's that they'd be giving information to the senator or representative to then be able to speak.
Exactly.
Okay. Very cool.
Exactly. Yeah. In the committees, during a public hearing, as you know, anyone can sign up to testify. A citizen can sign up for testify. But on the House floor, the Senate floor, only a member of the House or Senate can speak about a bill. Um, Ready to move on to the next slide? So much in Maine, in the legislative process is just driven by the calendar. So I want to spend a good chunk of time on the calendar and where the opportunities are to plug in as an advocate. So in Maine, we're in a 2-year legislative cycle. So the next cycle will begin after the election in a month. All your state senators and all your state reps will be reelected or newly elected. And then just 1 month after they've all been elected is a date that's known as cloture. And that's the deadline to file bills for the legislative session. So that means that a freshman legislator who's never served before could get elected in the beginning of November, and then by December, they have to file their ideas for what bills they want to introduce, which means if there's something that you want to do, you should really be thinking about it in a serious way and getting ready to talk to members, or candidates about it now, so that after the election in November, they're ready to hit the ground running. The session is 2 years. There's a long session, which is from December till around June. That's this session that's about to begin. Then they're on recess, for usually July till December. That's when working groups, commissions, study groups all meet and think about ways to improve legislation or other sticky issues during when the legislature's not meeting. And then they'll reconvene in January for what's called the short legislative session. Anything that's not passed by June of this year, the long legislative session, gets carried over until next year. So it has another bite at the apple. Generally, new legislation is not supposed to be introduced for the short legislative session unless it's an emergency bill. So, for example, during the short legislative session, after like going through COVID, there were bills that hadn't been considered to be needed because everything was emerging and changing. So an emergency might be, oh, let's revisit the vaccine mandate in these areas, or let's look at COVID leave policies that we need to enact. Also, it's just up to the legislative leadership to decide what counts as an emergency and what is not. So they can bend the rules to benefit themselves. And I wouldn't be completely scared off by that idea that it has to be emergency to be newly considered. I just say it because the best opportunity to get a bill guaranteed to be introduced and considered is before this December cloture deadline. So um, what is filed for that cloture date, it could be a very detailed proposal, or it could just be an idea. So, um, an example would be if you're an education advocate and you believe that teachers should have a minimum pay of $60,000 a year, you could ask a legislator to introduce a concept draft that says all teachers in Maine should be paid a minimum of $60,000 a year. Um, if you have all the details and you know how to be implemented, it could have all of that, or it could just say to increase teacher pay. Um, the more details, the better, I think. But if it's not ready for prime time, that's okay. The really important thing is just getting the concept draft is kind of a placeholder. Um, Next slide, please.
So to clarify, Brooke, then if folks aren't ready for that for this December, the next opportunity or the next cloture time would be December 2026. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. So it's a really short window in a 2-year cycle where the policy making is actually happening. And this is an even shorter window when it's the best opportunity to get a new idea put forward. So my recommendation would be if you have an idea of something you might want to do in the next 2 years, talk to a member, ask for a concept draft, even if it's not fleshed out, you'll get your foot in the door. Because a thing that's really amazing about Maine is that any bill that's introduced or every bill that's introduced gets a hearing and a vote in the committee. In Congress, in US Congress, there can be bills that a senator introduced year after year after year and never gets a committee hearing, never gets a vote. So the fact that you're guaranteed to get this idea heard by a committee of legislators is a great opportunity, and um, would definitely recommend using this closure deadline as an opportunity to get a placeholder idea in place.
And I don't know if you'll talk about this going forward, but that can also be kind of intimidating if someone says, okay, I'll put in a 2 sentence concept draft, but what if in the next year or the next few months I change my mind or want to pull it? Like, what is that? It doesn't mean that they will have to show up to a public hearing. Like they could
Correct.
pull it. Like, what
They
does the
could pull it.
polling process look like?
Yes. That process is just communicating. It becomes the legislator's bill. So let's say you talk to State Rep Kara Kaikini and say, hey, can you put in this placeholder for me? And you agree. It then belongs to Senator Kaikini. So, but it's up to you, it's up to the senator to proceed with that bill. But if you as the advocate say, you know what, I've decided to take a different direction, I don't think this is the right time for this policy anymore, you have no obligation as the advocate who proposed it to advance it forward. And you could ask Senator Kaikini to withdraw the bill. And that would be a simple process for the senator to do.
Okay, thanks.
So, after a legislator submits a bill or an idea for a bill, it gets assigns an LD number. LD stands for legislative document. And I'll also put this in the chat at the end. The Maine State Legislature website is pretty good, has some pretty good search features. So you will then have a bill page that includes all the information about the bill, the actual text, if it's had any votes, if it has any sponsors. Um, it also gets assigned to a committee. So thinking back to when I was talking about teacher pay, a bill about teacher pay would get assigned to the Education and Cultural Affairs Committee because it has to do with education. Donor milk bill, that was in the Health and Human Services Committee. Paid family leave, that was in the Labor and Housing Committee. Each committee in Maine has both senators and representatives, which is nice and efficient. But it also means that it has a Senate chair and a House chair. Based on the current split of power between Democrats and Republicans, right now the committees each have usually 8 Democrats and 5 Republicans. That could shift. So if the Republicans take the majority in either house, the Republicans could have the majority on the committee. So it's meant to reflect the balance of power in the overall house. Um, so as I said, once a bill gets assigned to a committee, that's also a great time to sign up for those committees' email updates because then you'll be the first to know when a bill is scheduled for a public hearing. Um, I've not heard about any changes for the upcoming legislative session. I believe that testimony will still be accepted both online via Zoom and in person. I think that's one of those changes that COVID brought to us that fortunately is here to stay. It's just a fantastic way for people who don't live within a short drive of Augusta to be able to be represented as well as someone who lives just down the street. So I certainly hope that that will continue in perpetuity. At the public hearing, there are different rules in each committee. Some are more strict than others. Generally, it's about a 3-minute time limit to testify. And you would say something like, my name is Brooke Barron. I live in Harpswell. I believe that donor breast milk is important for these 3 reasons, and I urge you to vote for this bill. It can be pretty simple, straightforward. Some people are who are comfortable share very personal stories. It can be on certain issues. It can be really emotional, um, but it's a really fantastic opportunity. And I always really learned a lot as a legislative staffer hearing all of the testimony on both sides. Um, After the public hearings, then there's usually a couple of weeks where the committee staff are preparing more research, answering questions of the members of the committee, and then they'll schedule a work session. A work session is when the vote happens in the committee. These 2 purple lightning bolts I put in here are to identify times when advocacy is appropriate. It is a good time to get involved. So both at the public hearing, through testimony, through a protest, through holding signs, through email, through all those things we talked about before, and then before the work session when the vote actually happens. Going back to that slide of all the different ways to get involved, those are all different times that any of those activities would be appropriate. Um, yes, Jen, go for it.
If I know they used to put 8 Democrats and 5 Republicans usually, if somebody is an independent, do they get put in there with them, or do they take the
They
place of one or
do.
the other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Usually the independents will um I'm trying to think of how it has worked. I think because the numbers are not exact, usually that there'll be a place for an independent on the committee they're interested in serving in. Um, Usually the independents will have some kind of ideological bent, like they'll be more left leaning or more right leaning, and so they would replace a Democrat or Republican. Um, but I think it's one of these things. The Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate assign the members. So in all of these areas, there's the formal process, but there's also a human element. So it's not totally set in stone.
I got you.
The independents would definitely be serving on these committees as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a really good question.
Can I add something about public hearings, Brooke?
Yes.
So it can be, so I've given public testimony on donor milk and paid leave on behalf of the Maine State Breastfeeding Coalition. And that giving testimony on behalf of an organization can be powerful, but it really can be more powerful to have individual stories being told. I might be able to reference, lactating parents in general, or I might even have a story about one person that I could share in my testimony, but it's just so much more powerful to have people share their own stories. So I just want to say that as the executive director of the Breastfeeding Coalition, that even if you see that we're going to be giving public testimony, that doesn't mean that you don't need to or that you shouldn't as well. I think that it's still powerful to have individuals sharing their stories.
I absolutely agree. Um, and from the perspective as someone who listened to many hours a week of these hearings as my job, it was usually a lot more meaningful and refreshing to hear about someone's actual lived experience instead of the polished testimony of a lobbyist. who is being paid by their employer to give a certain presentation. So you
Yeah, you
have a lot
have,
to offer.
right. I don't know if you'll talk about lobbyists at all, but they generally like are just there with their laptops all day long in those committees, ready to give testimony on as many bills as they can. Uh,
Exactly.
and it's you want that. You want someone who can always be there to speak. You know, the Maine Women's Lobby does that as well, and they often are representing a lot of our shared interests. But it's just still so much more powerful to have the individuals. And I am glad that that Zoom option, I hope that it does stay as well, because yeah, getting to Augusta in the middle of the day is just not a reality for the majority of Mainers.
Exactly. And we can move to the next slide. So once a bill has its work session, so that's its vote in committee, if at least one committee member votes to advance it, then it gets advanced to the House and Senate. If everyone at the committee thinks it's a bad idea, then the bill dies. But if even one person thinks it should become a law, then it moves forward. So another change that will be happening after the November election is both the House and the Senate will be electing internally their leaders. So the House will be electing the Speaker of the House, the Senate will be electing the President of the Senate. Last session, that was Speaker Talbot Ross, Rachel Talbot Ross, and Senate President Troy Jackson. Troy Jackson is termed out, no longer state senator, and Rachel Talbot Ross is running for the Senate. So it's like a blank slate. There'll be no leaders who were leaders last time. And so we don't know who the Speaker or the President of the Senate will be. We'll find out probably in December. The Speaker and the Senate President have a lot of ability to control the proceedings, the priorities, and they also have more staff and more leverage. So I worked with two of the speakers of the House. Once a bill comes through that committee with at least one legislator supporting it, it has its vote in the House. It's debate. That's when those floor speeches can come in. Um, if it gets through that first vote, then it goes to the Senate. Then it has another vote. So it's sort of like a weird, I don't know the reason for it. It's a kind of a strange procedural map, but it also means that there's two bites of the apple. So if you had a bill that didn't get enough votes during the engrossment first vote, but it was close, it was, 3, 4 votes away from passing, you have a week, you have a couple days to go and talk to those members and say, hey, I noticed you voted no. Here's why this bill is so important. I would really like you to reconsider, and here's why. And people switch their votes. Um, it happens often. And so there are just so many opportunities to bring a bill back from the brink. So don't give up. I think we saw that a little bit with donor breast milk. Donor breast milk got all the way through the first 2 engrossment bills, through the enactment bill, and then goes to appropriations table. Appropriations table is where bills get funded. So the idea is that the committees who are considering the bills are just considering if something's a good policy or not. They're not considering whether there's enough money for it. The money is something that's dealt with by the Appropriations Committee. They work really closely with the governor. The governor proposes a budget. There's always a little bit of money left over to spend on these other initiatives, but it's only enough money to fund a fraction of the bills that get that far. So the bill, like donor breast milk, gets all the way to passing the committees, passing the House and Senate, and I think it had about $150,000 price tag, something in that range, and there wasn't $150,000 for it, so it just sat there. It didn't get its final vote. It didn't get to the governor's desk until a whole year later, the end of the second legislative session, where they didn't have to go through these votes again. It was just sitting on the table. And when it came around to find funding for it, there had been enough positive conversations, enough advocacy around, hey, this $150,000 could go a really long way, that they took $150,000 from that leftover money and used it to fund the donor breast milk bill, which sent it straight to the Senate for its last vote and then to the governor's desk. So it's this extra hurdle that for everyone, including in the legislature, is mystifying, confusing. I think it's one of the most confusing parts of the legislative process that a bill can make it all the way through but not be funded and not become law. Um, but it's it's a great opportunity to ask questions. I think you're not like silly if you don't understand it. No one really understands it. But it's important, and there is some rationale behind it. Unlike US Congress, who can just pass a bill and borrow money from China to pay for it, the state of Maine, under by Constitution, has to balance its books. So it can't spend money unless it actually has money in its coffers to do so, which is a good thing. Um, so every year, tax revenue comes in, and they don't know until a certain point in the process how much money is actually going to be available to spend. So that's the reason the Appropriations Committee is needed and the appropriations table, and the reason for this extra complicated step. And it might be something like Maine Care for All. Maybe half the legislature believes it's a great idea. I don't think they actually do, but let's say in principle they all love it. But then when they get to the price tag, it's billions and billions of dollars. There might be something that you think is a good idea, but you realize there's not actually money to spend on it. Kara,
Yeah.
was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think this is really, really helpful to understand all the different steps and layers and see that there are many points of celebration, but also like let's say it passes the House and Senate, like that's really exciting, but to not get too too excited yet. Like, right, it has to still pass the appropriations. And if I'm remembering with the donor milk bill, it was the work session where they really got into the budget.
Mhm.
Is that usually when that is developed more
Um,
to
it
propose to
depends.
the appropriations? Or,
It, yes, yes. Right. So that's in the work session is when they come up with the price, when they work with the nonpartisan analysts to come up with the price tag. Um,
I
so
remember that with donor milk, and I was just a little bit, I was brought into that because I don't remember how exactly, but I was glad I was because the way it was written, it was a much higher price tag because they were assuming that these babies would solely be getting donor milk.
right.
And we know donor milk is expensive. So I had to clarify that the majority of these cases, it wouldn't be the baby wouldn't be only receiving donor milk. They would hopefully be receiving some of their own mother's milk as well. And so as far as the cost, it would be less. And that helped to have that understanding.
Totally. And that's a great example of how um, Kara had the expertise and the confidence to push back and not say, oh, well, the legislature is saying that it's going to cost this, so they must know best, because they don't know best. You all who are working in this, you know best. And to be able to provide that evidence-backed information about what a newborn is actually consuming in terms of the donor breast milk, that was they accepted that evidence and changed the price tag. So again, don't be intimidated. These are all just people working on it, and you will know more than a lot of those people. So you should have the confidence. You should feel the confidence to weigh in. Um, I want to leave a few minutes for final questions. So ending yeah, so lightning bolts, opportunities to weigh in. Again, it gets to the governor's desk. She might veto it. She has vetoed a lot of bills that people thought were really important. She also has an opportunity to let a bill become law without her signature. That is more of a messaging tool than anything else. It still becomes law, but it's her signal to say, I might have done things a little differently if it were me, but it's good enough. We'll let it become law. Um, Yes, that is the end of my presentation. If you go back 1 minute, Kara, or one slide, I just wanted to note that there are, if you can, it's okay if you can't. There are bills have until the end of the 2-year session to get through this whole process. So the donor milk bill zoomed through these first 4 steps in the first few months of the first session and then sat there for a year. It still became law at the end of the second session. once it becomes law, depending on the bill, it might be too complicated to just go out and start being implemented, like paid family leave, for example. That's a big, complicated bill. Um, and there were enough things that were left vague, or really this would have happened no matter what. But there's now an office within the Department of Labor that's charged with implementing it. So they are currently undergoing rulemaking. I'm sure a lot of you have weighed in on that. I know that the Breastfeeding Coalition has been active in making sure that the rules that actually say how paid family leave becomes law are as strong and fair as possible. So that's another opportunity for advocacy. Looking at something like donor breast milk, um, my understanding is that in some ways it hasn't been implemented exactly as envisioned. So that might be something that's revisited this year to say, hey, we passed the law, it's doing what it needs to do, but there's important tweaks that need to occur. So the process is ongoing. And I really see that as the positive because there's a lot of opportunities to get involved and to weigh in. Um, this was a pretty quick and dirty overview. A lot of it comes down to timing. I'm going to drop some links in the chat that I hope are helpful resources. Um, and feel free to ask questions and to follow up with me in the future if you have anything you want to run by me. But
Awesome.
thank you. That's what I have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brooke. This is really, really helpful. It even though I've learned a lot over the last years with paid leave, and that's, as you said, it's something that kept coming back and back and back before it finally got passed. And there were so many different versions of it that were proposed. And I think that's a great point that it often is left kind of vague and that the rules don't actually get written or solidified until after. And that's a process a lot of people don't know about or hear about. And so I'm learning for the first time what that process is all about through the Maine Paid Leave Coalition and kind of following along. And whenever we're talking about educating the public about it all, I've explained that I feel like we need to clarify that. Sure, you may have given public testimony already, but that doesn't mean that it feels like we're always asking people to share their stories and contact. And I could see how people might be like, I already did this. Are we not really done with this yet? And like, no, actually, we're not. So I really like these slides, Brooke, and I wonder if we could create some um uh like Instagram
Sure.
called like a carousel or something like that with these slides to show and explain that and maybe add something about rulemaking to it as well. Because that is a piece, kind of like what happens after a bill is passed section.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Yes, and I mean, I strongly, from my years working in policy, I strongly believe that progress is almost always incremental. I worked on the paid family leave bill in 2019, and we were just like absolutely devastated by the failure to get support. Um, and, we ended up with a legislative commission, which we didn't think was enough. But that commission did the work, did the research, built the popular support for this, also gave time for the advocates to start organizing and talking about a possible ballot initiative, because that's another lever. And by the time it came back up in 2023, 4 years later, 4 years of feeling like, oh, I can't believe we couldn't get this done, then the political system had shifted and there was enough energy on our side, and it is now law and is now going towards implementation. So, um,
yeah,
any big structural change like that takes time, um, and persistence is really important.
yeah. And as far as donor milk goes too, Crystal, your comments about your experience with trying to get a milk bank set up, and you're seeing that access and affordability is a huge part of anything like that Medicaid coverage for donor milk bill. And I was just contacted by the Office of Medicaid to ask if there's been any input from folks in the community about the access to donor milk. They're wanting to put together some education around the coverage. And I was so glad to hear that. I think the person that's in that role, in the maternal child health role at Medicaid right now is fantastic, and really looking at how can we make sure people understand how this works. And also, do we need to change things a little bit? Like you said, Brooke, like there's always possibility to go back and change things. It doesn't mean that it could never be changed. So input like that, Crystal, is really helpful for me. I think the milk bank is also hearing probably more than anyone how accessible and affordable this is even with main care coverage. But I would love to hear more about that and pass that on. And just to emphasize that we're not a lobbying association, right? Maine State Breastfeeding Coalition isn't, but we do have room in our time to do more advocacy. And if there are any issues that you feel like you are seeing out in the community that could be improved through policy, through state policy, then please speak up and let me know, and we can talk through what the next steps could be. Great. Yeah, Crystal, we'll talk more.
I'll put in a quick plug, Kara, that we have a policy and advocacy committee in the Maine State Breastfeeding Coalition. And so we're always looking for volunteers to join. And we would love for all of you to join.
Yeah. And the efforts in that committee right now are focused on making sure paid leave actually gets built in the way that we want it to be built, and the word gets out. So I'm on the paid leave coalition and also the paid leave organizing committee. And that is what I consider our role, is to help organize and educate folks on it. So there's that piece, and then just keeping tabs on donor milk and continuing to stay in touch with the milk bank, and also keeping tabs on potential doula legislation. We don't have anything that is a concept draft for this year, though I imagine maybe in 2 years we'll have more organization around another idea if we think that it's necessary. Any other questions for Brooke? This has been really helpful. And your contact info, Brooke, if
Yes, I'll put my contact info in the chat.
Awesome. I also know how to contact Brooke if if you want some help with that. Great. Brooke with an e.d.barron@gmail.com for any folks watching the recording that might not be able to see that. All right, thank you so much, Brooke. This has been really, really wonderful, and I look forward to sharing the slides and the information elsewhere too.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Have a great day.